I want to start by telling you about propane because I think most people who have not lived in a rural area with an older house have not thought carefully about propane as a utility, and the details matter to this story in ways that will become clear. Propane is not like electricity or municipal gas, where you flip a switch and the thing happens and somewhere very far away a meter runs and once a month a bill arrives. Propane is local. Propane is specific. Propane is in a tank on your property, a tank that you own or that your supplier owns depending on your arrangement, and the amount of propane in that tank is something you monitor and manage and refill on a schedule that suits your usage. You know when your tank is full because you watched the truck fill it. You know when it is getting low because the gauge tells you, or because your appliances start behaving differently, the water heater recovery slows, the stove flames blue but thin, the furnace cycles differently on cold mornings. You know your propane the way you know everything that is specific and finite on a rural property. You know it because you have to. My name is Calvin Prout. I am 56 years old. I live on a 12-acre property in Brannigan County, Tennessee, in a house that was built in 1962 by my grandfather and that I have owned and maintained since 1998, when my parents retired to Florida and signed it over to me because I was the one who wanted to stay and they were the ones who wanted warm winters. The house has a 200-gallon propane tank that supplies the furnace, the water heater, the kitchen range, and the fireplace insert, 4 appliances, all of which I depend on through a Tennessee winter, and most of which I depend on year-round to some degree. The tank sits on a concrete pad I poured myself, chained to a ground anchor, on the east side of the house, where the delivery truck can access it easily from the driveway. The propane tank is mine. The propane in it is mine. I own the tank outright. I purchased it from my supplier 12 years ago rather than leasing it, because owning is better than leasing for a long-term property where you are not going to switch suppliers and where the math favors ownership after a certain number of years. When I say the propane in the tank is mine, I mean this in the most literal sense. I bought it from my supplier at a specific price per gallon, had it delivered on a specific date, and the record of that delivery and that purchase is in my files. It is my propane the way the food in my refrigerator is my food, not an abstraction, not a utility arrangement, but a specific purchased quantity stored in a specific vessel on my specific property. The situation with the HOA requires some explanation, because my property is not the kind of rural 12-acre property that you would expect to be subject to any HOA governance, and you would be mostly right. The 12 acres were not part of any HOA development. But when the county road behind my property was extended in 2008, the extension created access to a previously landlocked parcel adjacent to my eastern boundary, and a developer subsequently platted a 36-lot rural residential community called Brannigan Hollow Estates on that parcel. The development was organized with an HOA because the developer needed the HOA structure to manage the shared road that served the lots. My property predated the development and was not part of it. I was not a member of the Brannigan Hollow Estates HOA, had never been asked to join, and had no covenants or restrictions related to it on my deed. The shared road that served the Brannigan Hollow lots, however, ran along the edge of my eastern fence line for approximately a quarter mile before turning into the development. The road was on platted HOA right-of-way, not on my property. But the proximity of the road to my property, and specifically the proximity of my propane tank, which was visible from the road on the east side of my house, apparently gave certain people associated with the Brannigan Hollow HOA the impression that my property's amenities were more accessible than they were. The HOA's maintenance operations were run by a facilities manager named Doug Phelps, who had taken on the position when the development was established and who managed the shared road maintenance, the community center HVAC system, and the small irrigation system in the Brannigan Hollow common areas. Doug was a practical man, generally speaking. I had spoken to him perhaps 4 times over the years on matters related to the shared road, and we had always gotten along without difficulty. He understood property lines, and he understood that my 12 acres were mine and not part of his domain. The problem was not Doug. The problem was the board that had been elected to govern the HOA in the development's 4th year. specifically a board president named Martin Keel, who had moved into Brannigan Hollow from suburban Nashville with the energy of someone who had decided that country living was an opportunity to become a large fish in a small pond, and who had applied that energy to the HOA board position with a thoroughness that the position had not previously required. Martin reorganized the HOA's finances, renegotiated several service contracts, and in the process of renegotiating the propane contract for the community center, which ran on a propane furnace, apparently decided that the community center's propane consumption was higher than necessary and that there were opportunities for cost reduction that he had not yet fully explored. The cost reduction he arrived at apparently was not switching propane suppliers or improving the community center's insulation. It was my tank. I first noticed something was wrong in November of Martin's second year as board president. I had filled my tank in October, a full delivery, 180 gallons, which gave me the full capacity of the 200-gallon tank minus the mandatory 10% kept empty for expansion. I knew exactly how much propane was in my tank. I know my usage patterns well, 30 years on this property, same 4 appliances, same seasonal rhythms. By mid-November, I should have used approximately 22 to 25 gallons based on 2 weeks of moderate furnace use, daily hot water, cooking, and occasional fireplace use. The gauge read lower than that, significantly lower. I estimated the tank was down approximately 40 gallons rather than the 25 I expected. I told myself I had miscounted or that the October weather had been harder on the furnace than I remembered, and I checked the weather data for October on my phone and found it had been a relatively mild month, which did not explain a furnace using 50% more propane than normal. I noted the discrepancy in the notebook I keep for property maintenance records and watched the gauge more carefully. By the end of November, the gauge told me I had used approximately 65 gallons since the October fill. My expected usage for that period, based on historical records I had kept for 6 years, was 30 to 35 gallons. I was using, or something was consuming, nearly double my normal propane at a point in the season when usage was moderate, not peak. I called my supplier and asked if there was any known issue with propane gauges on tanks like mine that could produce false low readings. They said gauge errors were uncommon but possible and offered to send a technician. The technician came the following week, tested the gauge, and said it was accurate within normal tolerance. He confirmed the tank was at approximately the level the gauge showed, which was consistent with 60-plus gallons of consumption in 2 months. I walked the house. I checked every appliance for leaks, unusual cycling, any sign of malfunction. Everything was running correctly, no leaks, no anomalies. My usage was normal. Something was taking propane that was not my appliances. I'm not an investigative person by nature. I am a retired general contractor who now does occasional consulting work, and my professional skill set is building things and managing projects, not detecting theft. But I had been building and managing things for 30 years, and one of the things you learn in that profession is that when something is wrong and the obvious explanations have been eliminated, you need to watch before you act. You need to see what is actually happening rather than hypothesize about it. So I set up a camera. The camera was a trail camera, the same model hunters use for monitoring game, motion-activated, infrared for night vision, waterproof for weather. I mounted it on the east eave of my house, aimed at the propane tank. The positioning gave it a clear view of the tank's valve assembly and the concrete pad around it. I ran it for a week before checking the results. The results answered every question I had and introduced several new ones. The camera had triggered on 6 separate occasions over the 7 days it ran. 4 triggers were deer. My property has white-tailed deer, and they wander near the house in the evenings with the casual indifference of animals who have decided the property belongs to them regardless of the deed. 2 triggers were not deer. The 2 non-deer triggers were, respectively, Thursday evening at 8:44 and Saturday morning at 7:12. In both instances, a pickup truck had pulled off the Brannigan Hollow shared road onto the narrow grass strip along my fence line. A man had gotten out carrying a portable propane transfer device, a transfer hose with a regulator fitting designed to move propane from one tank to another, and had connected this device to my tank service valve, transferred an estimated quantity of propane to portable cylinders he had in the truck bed, disconnected, and driven away. Both times, the process took approximately 12 to 15 minutes. I could identify the truck in both sets of photographs. It was a grey Ram 1500 with a Brannigan Hollow Estates Maintenance logo on the door panel. I sat at my kitchen table with those photographs printed in front of me for a long time. I had been a general contractor for 30 years. I had dealt with material theft on job sites. I had dealt with equipment going missing. I understood what theft looked like, and I understood the specific quality of organized, casual, repeat theft, the kind where someone has decided the risk is low enough and the convenience high enough that they do it again and again with the same unhurried efficiency as any other regular task. The man in the photographs was not furtive. He was not rushing. He connected the transfer hose and transferred propane with the manner of someone who had done this many times and expected to continue doing it. I did not call the sheriff that day, though I would. I wanted to know first what I was dealing with, whether this was Doug Phelps acting independently, whether it was HOA board direction, whether it was Martin Keel specifically, or whether it was some other arrangement I had not yet understood. I needed more information before I decided what to do with what I had. I called my neighbor 3 properties down on the county road, a woman named Betty Chance, who had lived in the area for 40 years and who knew everyone in the county by name and affiliation. Betty was 72 and sharp in the way of people who have paid close attention to their surroundings for 7 decades. I said I had a property situation, and I wondered if she knew anything about the Brannigan Hollow maintenance operation. She said she knew Doug Phelps had been doing the maintenance since the beginning. I said, had she noticed any changes in how the maintenance was being done? She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Calvin, I saw Doug's truck at your place one evening last month. I didn't think much of it. Should I have?" I said yes. She said, "That boy Martin Keel has been running that HOA like he's running a corporation. He cut the propane delivery for the community center in half in September, and I know because my daughter's husband does the deliveries and he told me." She paused. "Calvin, are you telling me they've been taking your propane?" I said I had photographs that suggested exactly that. She said, "Lord." I said yes. That conversation gave me what I needed to understand. Martin Keel had reduced the community center's propane deliveries, presumably to cut costs and demonstrate financial management to the board, and had supplemented the community center's propane supply by having the maintenance truck draw from my tank. Whether Doug Phelps had been directing this or had been told to do it by Martin, I did not yet know. What I knew was that it was organized. It had been happening for at least 6 weeks that I could document, and it involved a Brannigan Hollow HOA vehicle and equipment. I called an attorney named Frank Tartum in Brannigan County, who had done title work for me when I refinanced the property 8 years ago. I described the situation and told him I had photographic evidence. Frank said, "Calvin, what you have is documented theft of personal property. Propane in a private tank is personal property. The transfer hose is burglary equipment in this context, using a tool to access a secured container to steal the contents. In Tennessee, theft of property valued over $1,000 is a Class D felony." He asked me to estimate the quantity stolen. I said based on my usage discrepancy and the visible delivery dates from my supplier's records, I believed somewhere between 80 and 100 gallons had been taken over approximately 6 to 8 weeks. At current prices, that was between $300 and $400 in propane value. He said that's below the felony threshold, but it's solid misdemeanor theft, and the organized, repeated nature of it matters. He said I had 2 options, criminal complaint with the sheriff or a civil action or both. He recommended both in sequence: file the criminal complaint first to establish the official record, then pursue civil remedies including the cost of the stolen propane plus punitive damages for the intentional nature of the taking. I said I also wanted to do one more thing before the complaints were filed. Frank said, "What was that?" I said I wanted to lock the tank, not just the service valve. I wanted a proper security enclosure that prevented access to the valve at all without my specific key. Frank said that was my right as the tank's owner and was a reasonable protective measure. He said, "Calvin, documenting the secure state of the tank before they try to access it again will strengthen the evidence of the prior unauthorized access. I said I had already thought of that. I called a welding shop in town the next morning and described what I wanted. The welder, a man named Pete Cassidy, who had done work for me twice before, said he could build it in a day. I described the design, a steel cage that enclosed the tank's service valve area, welded in place on the tank's collar with a heavy-duty hasp and a hardened steel padlock. The cage would not prevent access to the tank itself. The tank was 300 pounds of steel on a concrete pad and was not going anywhere, but it would make the service valve completely inaccessible without the padlock key, which I would keep on my person and in my house and nowhere else. Pete said he could have it done by Friday. I said perfect. The cage went on Friday afternoon. Pete came out and welded it in place in about 4 hours, clean work, solid welds, properly fitted to the tank collar, with the hasp positioned so the padlock hung at a height and angle that was accessible to me without stooping and inaccessible to any transfer hose or tool without the lock being removed. I painted the cage black to match the tank. I photographed the completed installation from multiple angles and noted the date and time in my records. Then I called Frank Tartum and told him the tank was secured. He said file the criminal complaint Monday morning. I said I would. But before Monday, something happened that I had not expected. Saturday evening, at 11:22, the trail camera triggered. The grey Ram 1500 pulled off the road onto the grass strip. The same man got out with the transfer hose. He walked to the tank, connected the hose to the service valve area and then stopped. He tried again. He crouched and looked at the valve area. He tried a third time. He stood up and looked at the cage. He stood there for approximately 4 minutes, a long time in camera triggering terms, and then he disconnected the hose, put it back in the truck, got in, and drove away. I checked the camera Sunday morning and watched that footage 3 times. The 4-minute pause in front of the cage was the most satisfying 4 minutes of video I had seen in a long time. I could not hear what was happening during those 4 minutes. I did not need to. The man's posture and movement told the complete story of someone who had arrived expecting a routine task and encountered an obstacle that changed the nature of everything about what he thought he was doing and who he thought he was doing it to. I went inside and made coffee and waited for Monday. HOA kept stealing propane from my tank, so I locked it up and watched them panic. Monday morning, I drove to the Brannigan County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak to a detective. The desk officer sent me to a man named Detective Lawrence Prout, no relation. Though he noted the shared name with the brief acknowledgement that shared names produce in rural counties where families have been around long enough that the same surnames recur, who had been with the department for 19 years and who took in the situation with the focused attention of someone who recognized organized theft when it was described to him. I brought the trail camera footage on my laptop, my supplier's delivery records showing the October fill and all prior fills for comparison, my handwritten consumption log going back 6 years, and the printed photographs from the Thursday and Saturday incidents. Lawrence looked at all of it without hurrying. He watched the footage twice. He said, "Calvin, the truck is clearly identified." I said, "Yes." He said, "You know whose truck that is?" I said I did. He said, "Tell me." I told him about the Brannigan Hollow HOA, Martin Keel, Doug Phelps, and what Betty Chance had told me about the community center's propane delivery being cut in half in September. Lawrence wrote everything down. He said, "Is there anything else?" I said yes. There was the Saturday footage, which I had not initially mentioned. He said, "Let's see it." I played the Saturday footage. He watched the 4 minutes of the man standing in front of the locked cage in silence. When it ended, he said, "That's a man who's just realized something." I said that was my interpretation too. Lawrence said he would open a case and that the next step was identifying the individual in the footage. He believed he could do that from the Brannigan Hollow HOA maintenance records, which he would request. He said Martin Keel's name would be relevant if the evidence supported direction from the board level rather than independent action by the maintenance employee. He said, "Calvin, if this was directed by the board president, that's a different charge picture than if a maintenance guy went rogue." I said I understood and that I would let him work through the evidence sequence. He took my contact information and said he would be in touch. Frank Tartum filed the civil complaint that afternoon, independently of the criminal matter. The civil complaint named both the Brannigan Hollow HOA as an entity for the use of its vehicle and equipment in the theft, and Martin Keel individually as the party whose cost-cutting decision had apparently initiated the practice. It also named John Doe pending identification of the individual in the footage. Frank said the civil complaint was preserved at this stage without aggressive pursuit, since the criminal investigation would produce the factual record we needed, and we did not want to interfere with Lawrence's process. What Lawrence's process produced over the following 3 weeks was the complete picture. The individual in the footage was Doug Phelps. Lawrence identified him from the HOA's maintenance records, confirmed with a comparison to Doug's driver's license photo, and then brought Doug in for an interview. Doug, to his credit, and consistent with my prior impression of him as a basically reasonable man caught in a bad situation, told Lawrence the truth. He said Martin Keel had asked him in September to stop refilling the community center's propane tank through the regular supplier, because Martin was trying to show cost savings and had decided that the community center's propane usage was an easy target. When Doug had pointed out that the community center still needed propane for heat and hot water, Martin had said he had identified a source and had given Doug a transfer hose and specific instructions. Use the maintenance truck, access the property adjacent to the shared road during evening hours, draw propane from the private tank there, bring it back in portable cylinders, and refill the community center's connection from the cylinders. Martin had characterized this to Doug as borrowing from a neighboring property that had more than it needed. Doug said he had been uncomfortable with this from the beginning, but had been told by Martin that it was a temporary arrangement and that Martin had an understanding with the property owner. He said he had done it 6 times before the cage went on and had been relieved, in a way he could not articulate to Martin, when the cage made it impossible to continue. He said he had told Martin the tank was now secured and that they needed to go back to the regular supplier. He said Martin had told him to find another solution. Doug gave a full statement and cooperated completely with the investigation. Lawrence told me this privately and said it was relevant to how the charges would be apportioned. Martin Keel was interviewed the following week. His interview, according to Lawrence's characterization when he called me afterward, was considerably less cooperative. Martin initially denied knowing anything about propane being taken from my property. When Lawrence showed him the footage of the HOA truck and described Doug's statement, Martin revised his position to say that Doug had been acting on his own initiative. When Lawrence explained that Doug's statement directly contradicted this and was consistent with specific details that would be difficult to fabricate, Martin's attorney, he had arrived with one, asked for a break in the interview. When they resumed, Martin said no further comment. The district attorney's office reviewed Lawrence's case file and charged both Doug and Martin. Doug was charged with theft of personal property, a Class A misdemeanor in Tennessee given the value of the propane taken. Martin was charged with criminal conspiracy to commit theft and theft by direction, the latter being the charge applicable when one person directs another to commit a theft on their behalf. The criminal conspiracy charge carried the same offense level as the underlying theft. Both were misdemeanor charges. Both carried potential penalties of up to 11 months and 29 days in jail plus fines. Doug's attorney negotiated a plea agreement within 3 weeks. Doug agreed to a guilty plea to the theft charge, accepted a sentence of probation, community service, and restitution, and agreed to cooperate fully with any further proceedings against Martin Keel. Doug also resigned from the Brannigan Hollow HOA's maintenance position, which was the appropriate outcome for someone who had been executing a theft on behalf of his employer. Martin Keel's case moved more slowly. His attorney filed a motion to suppress certain evidence, which the court denied. He filed a motion to dismiss, which the court also denied. The trial date was set for the following spring. 2 months before the trial date, Martin's attorney contacted the DA's office and negotiated a plea to a single count of criminal conspiracy, conditional on restitution and a sentence of supervised probation. The DA accepted the plea. Martin Keel served no jail time. He paid restitution the agreed value of the propane taken, calculated at my supplier's current per-gallon price, which came to $387 plus a fine and court costs. The civil action produced a different and more significant outcome. Frank Tartam's complaint, which had been pending during the criminal process, was now moved forward with the benefit of the criminal case's factual record. The HOA, as an entity, had a significant exposure because the theft had been carried out using HOA equipment, an HOA vehicle, and an HOA employee acting under the direction of the HOA's board president. The HOA's insurance carrier, a commercial liability policy that the HOA maintained, as most HOA organizations do, reviewed the situation and determined that the intentional nature of the theft was relevant to coverage. Intentional acts are typically excluded from commercial liability coverage. They retained their own counsel and ultimately concluded that the coverage exclusion applied and that the carrier was not obligated to defend or indemnify, which left the HOA as an entity exposed without insurance coverage in a civil action, which was a position the HOA's attorney explained to the remaining board members with sufficient clarity that they immediately initiated removal proceedings against Martin Keel from the board president position, which was somewhat academic since the criminal charge had already effectively ended his governance role, but the formal removal was appropriate, and they did it. The board then authorized settlement discussions with Frank. The civil settlement reached with the HOA covered the following: restitution for the stolen propane at current market prices, the cost of the steel cage Pete Cassidy had welded onto my tank, the cost of the trail camera I had purchased for monitoring, Frank's legal fees, and a negotiated sum for the general trespass and intrusion onto my property, which Frank had calculated based on the number of documented incidents and the duration of the ongoing trespass. The total settlement was $14,200. The HOA paid it from reserves, which I was told had been substantially depleted by the cost of Martin's legal defense before the insurance coverage question was resolved and the HOA stopped paying for his attorney. Martin's mismanagement had cost the HOA considerably more in legal fees and settlement than the propane deliveries he had been trying to avoid. The cage is still on my tank. I left it in place after everything was resolved because I had paid Pete to weld it there, and it was good work, and it protected a valve that I had previously never thought to protect because I had never had reason to. It does not inconvenience me. I have a key on my keychain and a key in the house, and the padlock takes 4 seconds to open when I need the valve, which is only when the supplier comes to fill the tank, which is twice a year. The rest of the time the lock is on, and the valve is secure, and I do not think about it. The trail camera is still running. The deer trigger it regularly. They have been back through the whole sequence of seasons since the camera went up. The same does and yearlings I have been watching on this property for years, moving through the east side of the property in the evenings with the comfortable certainty of animals who have concluded I am harmless and who are, in this assessment, correct. They are not taking my propane. They are not taking anything. They are just moving through in the evening light the way they always have, the way things move through this property when nothing is wrong, which is the state I was in before Martin Keel arrived, and the state I returned to after he was gone. Betty Chance called me when the civil settlement was finalized. She said, "Calvin, I want you to know I'm glad it worked out." I said I was glad too. She said, "That man didn't understand that people around here know their property." I said that was right. She said, "He also didn't understand that you don't steal from a man who keeps records." I said that was also right, and I thanked her for the information she had given me about the propane deliveries, which had been important context for understanding what I was looking at. She said, "Calvin, I've lived here 40 years. I know when something doesn't add up." I said I knew the feeling. The November after everything was resolved, I had my regular fill, 180 gallons, same as always, same supplier, same driver who had been doing my deliveries for 11 years. He filled the tank and showed me the delivery ticket, and I signed it and filed it in my maintenance records. I watched the gauge settle at full, and I noted it in the notebook. Then I unlocked the cage, checked the valve area, relocked the cage, and went inside. The furnace ran through November with the efficiency it has always run. The water heater recovered in the time it has always recovered. The kitchen range burns blue, and even the way it has for 30 years. The fireplace insert on cold evenings fills the living room with the particular warmth of a properly functioning gas insert, which is steady and reliable and sufficient. My propane lasts exactly as long as it has always lasted, because the only things using it are the 4 appliances it has always served, which use exactly the amount they have always used, which I know because I have been recording it for 6 years, and because 30 years on this property with these utilities has given me the kind of knowledge that comes from paying attention over a long time to things that matter. The gauge shows what I expect it to show. The cage is on the valve, the lock is locked, the key is in my pocket and in my kitchen drawer and nowhere else. Everything is accounted for, it always will be. Thumbnail text, asterisk. They stole my propane, the cage ended that lesson.